Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Festival of Disruptive Thinking, Decolonisation, and what does it even mean? This is being held as part of the Entrepreneurship Institute's Festival of Disruptive Thinking. I can't see any of you, Lauren and I can't see any of you. So my name is Sarah Guerra. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm here to open and moderate this event. And we're really lucky to have Lauren Blackwood here with us today. For those not familiar with the Entrepreneurship Institute at King's, they believe that everyone can be entrepreneurial. And the entrepreneurial people can help make the world a better place by solving problems to create a healthier, smarter, more equal and sustainable future. Their role is to help all King's students, staff and alumni to develop entrepreneurial mindsets and to help our community. To help our community become a more creative problem solver, develop skills that will make them more employable or boost their careers, come up with more disruptive and innovative ideas, and of course, start and scale startups. And for any of you that have heard me speak on equality, diversity and inclusion, that's a very similar philosophy to the one I have for equality, diversity and inclusion. The AKC lecture I did, what feels like 100 years ago now, was all about diversity as a disruptor and an innovator. So yeah, I'm really excited and pleased to be here as part of this festival. It celebrates disruptive thinkers, creative problem solvers and innovative ideas in and around King's. In addition to the many startup founders, there are academics, researchers and practitioners across our university who are challenging established norms to address some of the world's most pressing challenges. As I said, I really take that view with the way that we take forward equality, diversity and inclusion, that some of the way the world has constructed itself, and that's exactly what we're here to talk about today, the way that our world has been constructed by things that have happened in the past, how do we undo or disrupt the thinking that some of us may not even know we have and may not even be able to recognise around us. This is the first year the festival's ever been run at King's, and there are a range of exciting events that we strongly encourage you to take a look at on the festival website. Towards the end, I'll post some links to some of the other events to help you find those. So before we kick off, just some housekeeping. The event is being recorded, so please do mute your mics and keep your cameras off for the duration of the event. From what someone said, I'm not sure that you have the option of putting your camera on anyway. We'll take questions and answers and comments at the end. So Lauren's going to speak for about 30 minutes. So do put your thoughts and questions in the chat so that we can move straight to those towards the end. So just a little bit about Lauren before we kick off. I have the real pleasure of working with Lauren, and she is fascinating all the time. And one of the things she did recently was buy me an Audre Lorde book for my birthday, which has advanced my thinking unbelievably and is shameful really that I'd never read it before. So she'll be speaking to us about decolonisation and how it's become a buzzword rather than technical terminology, which is what it is. And it's a topic that we're talking about a lot in the higher education sector and across King's. There are a variety of different groups or pieces of thinking around it. Lauren is here at King's an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Project Officer, as well as a postgraduate researcher in philosophy, sociological philosophy at the University of Birmingham. Lauren's had the privilege to study sociology with an emphasis on colonialism, imperialism and economics at New Mexico State University, America, and has since continued to incorporate these epistemologies into a philosophy through her academic career. She describes herself as a tired, queer Pan-Africanist. And with that, I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. So, as Sarah said, my name is Lauren Blackwood. I use she, they, he pronouns. I'm one of the EDI project officers here at King's, and I'm also a researcher in philosophy, specifically with a sociological angle at the University of Birmingham. So my critiques of philosophy have been heavily influenced by my experience studying a variety of sociology modules during my undergraduate year abroad. My professors here were really crucial in shaping my understanding of the marginalizing experiences that I was facing, and specifically the day-to-day issues and how these were produced by systems of oppression and oppressive institutions. So I'll explain that a little bit more later on. But my current research focuses partly on the capitalist and colonial roots of cultural appropriation. So this positions me really well to discuss British colonialism, cultural appropriation, as it's one of the tools that's used historically and presently to further systems of oppression and empire today. So today I'm going to be applying my research to the institution of education specifically. And I'd like to preface by saying that I'm not speaking today as a representative of King's College. I'm speaking as a researcher and yeah, as a person who is marginalized by many institutions. So before I do this, I just have a question to point out the elephant in the room. Can everybody who is here put your hand up, so use the hand raising function, if you did not expect this talk to be led by somebody wearing a matching night tracksuit and a do-rag? And I need everybody to be honest, because if you're not honest, it defeats the point of me asking this. I was also going to wear my white Air Force Ones, but they're dirty.
We can't see your feet anyway.
So can anybody tell me how many hands are up? Because me and Sarah can't see hand functions. India, would you?
I can see them. Okay. I can see that there are 18 at the moment out of approximately 46 attendees. So about a third.
Cool. Okay, so can everybody put your hands down? And somebody who had their hand up, can you just try to explain to us what you expected and why you possibly think this is?
Can I speak?
Yes.
I think I would have expected someone wearing like a suit or something we generally assume is like professional. Even though that's not what I personally agree with, it's definitely something that I would have assumed, having that drilled into me since I was young, that is what you would wear in this setting.
Thank you. So yeah, that's exactly what the answer that I was looking for. Because we've all been socialized to understand professionalism, excellence, or knowledgeableness to look a certain way. And this is a direct product of colonial and imperial social conditioning. So those of us who aren't necessarily members of the dominant culture are expected to assimilate, whether this is the way that we dress, whether this is code switching. And this includes both like tangible and intangible colonial properties. So the way that I speak, the way that I dress, the books that I'm expected to read at university, we're all expected to assimilate to a certain degree. And I just want to preface this presentation by saying, if you're not ready to have conversations with people in the office dressed like this, then you're by no means ready to embark on decolonization. And that's a really important point. So thank you, Harshna. But having said that, I'm definitely really comfortable and confident to blow my own trumpet and say that regardless of what I'm wearing today, everybody here is going to learn something from me. And I think that this demonstrates how silly and ridiculous and harmful colonial norms, values, and ideologies actually are. So before we start, I'm going to go over some content warnings. We will be talking about slavery, eugenics, racism, imperialism, colonialism, patriarchy, queerphobia. We'll be talking about ableism, which isn't on this slide, and also genocide. Topics such as colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, they're going to be a trend throughout this presentation. So I'm giving the content warning now. But when we get to things like genocide, ableism, transatlantic slave trade, I will preface with more content warnings. If people want to leave and come back, that's absolutely fine. That's not a problem. If people want to leave and then watch the recording, that's also absolutely fine. I want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable being here and safe being here as far as possible. So some key messages that I want everybody to be able to take away from this presentation is that decolonization and institutional reform are very distinct processes with separate goals. They're not the same thing, and the language can't be interchanged. That's not how it works. It's also really important that people understand the historical and present day motivations for colonialism. So why did we even have colonialism in the first place? What were we trying to further by doing that? And also the importance of thinking more critically about the social justice language that we use, making sure that we use language that is correct and we're using it as intended, as defined. So I'd like to preface this by saying that a lot of the resources that I've used to contextualize colonialism and colonial tools are in relation to the USA. This is because Britain as a state has, and its institutions have historically been very good at erasing its history and records of its atrocities. So the fact that King's has recently established a King's Colonial Past research module speaks directly to this. Examples from the state is still completely relevant to Britain's context. This is because the only reason that Euro-Americans exist is because of British colonialism and British imperialism, specifically in the Americas. And for this reason, the norms, values, and remnants of British culture still presides and informs the foundation of the current social, political, and economic context within former colonies, and this includes settler Euro-America. So the examples that we see in the USA, the things that we see in the USA, are extremely relevant to our context within Britain today. So I've tried to make this presentation as accessible as possible by providing a digestible amount of information, but I definitely recommend that everybody here goes away and does some homework and then comes back and watches this session again, because there's absolutely no way that I can cover everything on the topic of decolonisation in this one 30-minute session. And also, if you work at a university, I highly recommend that you reach out and speak to your sociology departments and your political economy departments. They'll definitely be able to help you with some of the terminology and specifics that I'm talking about today. So why is it important that we use these terms properly and not as buzzwords, and that we don't misappropriate them? The terms on the right-hand side in the cloud were all founded to describe very specific lived realities within the current and historical world context, okay? Oftentimes it's the case that these terms are misused within mainstream conversations, specifically concerning social justice and equality. They're reduced to being metaphoric, and they oftentimes just become lay terms. So when this happens, they're completely taken out of their context. So the data, whether that's ethnography, qualitative or quantitative data, that these phrases and these terms were founded upon to explain and to describe, no longer apply to the term anymore when we use it in lay terms. Oftentimes that means that the terms don't become applicable to the real world or to people's actual lived experiences. And it also becomes reductive. So we reduce the terms to something that they're actually not. And this is definitely influenced by the gatekeeping of knowledge and the inaccessibility of academia, but also dismissive and ungenuine attitudes towards radical sociological theories. Those with high influence, but with little understanding of the terms, often encourage and normalize their misuse. And there are very few higher educations today who aren't misusing the term decolonisation. Everybody is decolonising reading lists and decolonising their classroom, but to use the term in this way serves to erase the research and the conclusions of decolonial theorists. It also misrepresents the context and the goals of decolonisation, and it commodifies radical theories so that we can attract a diverse range of students and maintain and further our oppressive institution. So to put that into some context, I found a TikTok user who gives a really concise analysis of the misappropriation of radical theory, specifically within the liberal mainstream. This video, he does talk very quickly because he's trying to get a lot of information into 1 minute. So I've pulled out some of the relevant points that he makes on the left-hand side. And also, it wasn't possible to download this video with closed captions. So I apologize to anyone who might need closed captions. And I can circulate the TikTok afterwards. If you watch it on actual TikTok, you can see closed captions.
You know, something I found very interesting is how all oppressive structures, most notably when they reach their late stage, all adopt a certain feature that allows them to maintain their oppressive power. The tactic is admittedly very clever. What is it, you may ask? Let me tell you. So the tactic, right, is the oppressive structure will co-opt the counter movements against that oppressive structure and depict them as merely an aesthetic or a trend. If you haven't already read it, Mark Fisher makes a point in this book about how this happens in late stage capitalism. I'm sure you all have seen this image of ASC's dress with a Mark Fisher quote on it, talking about how anti-capitalist themes are being consumed by the media without actually challenging the system. Anti-capitalism has become something that you cosplay as instead of something that you actively fight towards. What Mark Fisher says doesn't only apply to capitalism. I'm here to tell you right now that it applies to every oppressive structure, including late-stage racism and late-stage misogyny. Things like the blue-haired Emily meme made it so that things like BLM and ACAB look more like aesthetics than they do actual movements. And then watch how anti-sexism becomes a trend, an aesthetic, something you perform. Notice how the people at the forefront of these progressive aesthetics are not the people marginalized by the oppressive structure, but they're the oppressors themselves. This tactic is so effective because it delegitimizes the seriousness of these movements, which just makes it seem corny to support them.
Okay, so what this TikToker has said in in regards to higher education and like the context that we're speaking about is that radical terminology is routinely co-opted by the same institutions that this terminology has been founded to oppose. So decolonization, the term, has become a trend which is helping to reform oppressive institutions rather to challenge the existence of these institutions, which is what they were supposed to do in the first place. This has become a performance trend across the sector. So it was no longer than 3 weeks ago, I received an email from the Office of Students, which was very well intentioned, but they were saying how only a few higher education institutions are yet to start decolonizing their reading lists. But to use the term in this way, in my opinion, doesn't actually make any sense at all.
You know something I found?
So we all know that King's is a world-leading institution with a very, very high sphere of influence globally. So when we misuse the term decolonization or any other terms that have come out of radical theory, our contribution to erasure, misrepresentation, and commodification is overwhelmingly significant. So in the Times Higher Education World Rankings, King's is number 32. We're part of the Golden Triangle and a Russell Group university. I'll go into what the Golden Triangle is at the end of the presentation. And our literal motto in our Vision 2029 is to make the world a better place. If we're making the world a better place, what we're doing is taking the things that we see as leading, that we see as reputable, and essentially injecting them into society. And if we're misusing these terms, and then injecting that into society as a norm, that's very damaging, and it will have a lot of influence, specifically influence that essentially negates the work of radical theorists who have done this work and come up with these terminologies. So first, to understand the term colonialism, people generally think that colonialism is only settler colonialism, but this is incorrect. There are multiple forms of colonialism, and I'm going to discuss just two. So we have settler colonialism, which describes practices that deploy a settler society to inhibit the land that is being exploited. Imperialism is the means of extending this domination over a foreign nation in order to embark on colonialism. This domination can be gauged using political and economic control over a foreign nation, as well as direct settlement, okay? Whereas neocolonialism is the practice of culturally, economically, and politically dominant regions using capitalism, globalization, and cultural imperialism to indirectly influence a region. So in order to do this, dominant regions influence targeted regions via social, political, and economic institutions, okay? And this is where higher education comes into play. Higher education is a tool of capitalism which has perpetuated capitalism, globalization, and cultural imperialism. And when we do this, we typically market it as redevelopment aid that our institutions are doing for other overseas or global south institutions, but this oftentimes just has strings attached. So next, we're going to discuss these institutions more broadly, and then we're going to fine tune back down to higher education. So these are a list of institutions within the UK. There are numerous institutions within Britain. All of them were built to sustain British culture, including its tangible and intangible properties. So the things that we can physically hold, and also our norms, our values, our ideologies, our beliefs, even as far as the inequalities that we have and have distilled into other nations. It's important to understand that all of these institutions work interconnected with one another, hence Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, and hence Patricia Hill Collins' matrix of domination. Both of these theories highlight how intersecting systems of oppression affect the lives of diverse people. So for example, Black women will face racism and misogyny, as well as misogynoir, which is the impact of both racism and misogyny working at the same time. I'm going to pull out a few of these institutions quickly that are most relevant to this conversation. So closer to the bottom, you'll see economic systems as an institution. So Britain's economic system is capitalism. Closer to the bottom, we have religion. So Britain's religion, dominant religion that it used as a colonial tool was Christianity. And finally, education, because that's what we're here to talk about today. Education is a tool that is used to bank traditional beliefs, norms, and values of a culture into the students to prepare them to navigate the world that you have built for them, okay? So within Kings and the fact that we live in Britain, this includes norms and traditions of Western culture, so including norms of colonialism, empire and nationalism, imperialist ideology. So as I mentioned earlier on, King's introduced a module called King's Colonial Past. Dr. Liam Libbard was the lecturer for that, and in his open lecture, he discussed how Kings passed on imperial knowledge and language and other British values and cultural norms. And a prominent colonial education institutions which remain today include Imperial College London, it's literally in the name, King's, and the University of London, and we'll talk more about the University of London a little bit later on. I think it's really important to be able to visualize how these institutions interact with colonialism and oppression. So this is the way that I was taught. I'd like to preface this by this isn't entirely correct. It's a lot more complex than this. And since leaving sociology within uni and actually studying it and doing my own reading, I found that they're so much more interconnected than they are like this. But it's kind of like in GCSE biology, when they teach you the structure of a cell, any biologist will tell you that that is actually incorrect, but for all intents and purposes of passing your GCSEs, that's how they teach you. So essentially applying the same kind of rationale for the sake of this presentation as an introduction to decolonization, this should suffice. So at the top, we have our oppressive systems, okay? Specifically British oppressive systems. And then below that to the left, we have the social inequalities that these systems perpetuate. So white supremacy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, etc. And on the bottom right, we have the oppressive institutions that are used to perpetuate the systems of oppression and these social inequalities, okay? So, education, specifically King's, and the perpetuation and maintenance of social inequalities. Content warning for transatlantic slave trade. Here I'm going to be highlighting some of the research from the King's Colonial Past module last year. A student named Aisha Nazir found that King's foundation in settler colonialism is extremely vast, including funding that was received and King's educational outputs. So on this slide, you can see documentation of King's subscribers. And of some of these subscribers, specifically the two that are circled, a historian at UCL found that 10% of the founding subscriptors for King's were directly named recipients of slave compensation after 1834. And Palmer, which was one of the signatures that was circled in the previous slide, received compensation that roughly totals £400,000 today in today's money. So these are the people that founded King's, who set the foundations for King's. The research also explains that the further expansion of the British Empire during the 1800s saw institutions like King's become more and more involved in colonialism, and as well as colonialism's growth expanding, so did that of King's. So King's Military Sciences Department, which is currently known as the War Studies Department, played a main role in advancing the British Empire and thus advancing colonialism. The department trained personnel who conquered and administered the colonies. So this type of education provided the constant flow of manpower in order for Britain to control their empire. Additionally, imperial studies movement was used as a tool to create imperial unity in the home nation. So academics who created this movement, specifically from the University of London, sought to ingrain imperial norms, values, and ideologies into educational institutions with the aim of gaining imperial sympathy from people, and this was in 1914. And on this slide, you can see a list of the languages that King's taught in order to have people go over to the colonies and advance the empire. So, neocolonialism in higher education. Neocolonialism allows institutions to maintain their dominant position and continue to indirectly influence colonial agendas. So this includes furthering colonial norms and values. We get to maintain the idea of there being a hierarchy of knowledge. This knowledge is specifically validated by Western standards for epistemology, but we put Black people in our curriculums. We maintain our institution, but diversify the people who steer it, and then label it as decolonization in order to attract a diverse workforce and to attract a diverse student body. We partner with institutions in the Global South to provide support in rebuilding what we literally destroyed ourselves. But of course, this support simultaneously contributes to upholding Kings, as it's a two-way transaction, even though we aren't owed anything by Global South communities. So this is how neocolonialism can and does come to play in the present day within higher education. So in order to understand why this happens and why a lot of us do it, typically unconsciously, is to understand the fact that, like I said before, we have tangible and intangible properties of British colonialism. And an intangible property is the values and the beliefs and the norms that we hold in here. So unless we are decolonizing our minds as well as the institutions around us, we're not going to get very far. So British norms and values, institutions and systems of oppression are enforced on others through colonial practices. This enforcement is highly influenced by ethnocentrism. So as you can see on the slide, ethnocentrism is seeing one's own culture as the superior standard, whether that be consciously or unconsciously, and then making judgments about other cultures against this standard. Okay, so ethnocentrism then allows us to embark on cultural imperialism, which is the domination in cultural relationships in which the values, practices, and meanings of a powerful foreign culture are imposed upon one of or more native cultures. So an example of this would be the immaturity of citation styles. So we have APA, Harvard, and Chicago. They're all motivated by ethnocentrism. In order for these styles to recognize non-Western epistemology, we have to enforce assimilation on non-Western people so that these styles can recognize them. This is cultural imperialism, but it's also what we refer to as inclusion. So before we think about applying decolonial theory to our structures and our institutions, the tangible ones, we really have to understand that we are socialized to further colonial norms and ideology. So for this reason, it feels very uncomfortable to accept that it's not good enough to just include people in our workforce, to include people in our student body, in our curriculums, in our reading lists, if we actually just want to decolonize. Okay, we have to get rid of the thing that was designed to exclude them in the first place and rebuild from it. Our institutions are by no means broken because they exclude people and produce inequality. They were supposed to do this by design. Ethnocentrism is weaved into the fabric of our being, and it informs our equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives today. If we want to decolonize, it's not good enough to bring people in and remove some barriers, okay? So, content warning here for ableism, eugenics, genocide, transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to focus on ableism as a case study to illustrate how oppressive systems and institutions are this way by design. And by this way, I mean seeped in British colonial cultural properties and values. I'm using ableism because I came across a video of a writer who was explaining the historical genocidal marginalization of disabled people within institutions, and specifically the labor force. And this was during the transatlantic slave trade. And I think it's a really fitting example of how we've only ever reformed our institutions over time and reformed our oppressive practices with the guise of inclusivity. We've not actually eliminated or decolonized these practices. So afterwards, I'm going to discuss how this is transferable to higher education. But before I play this video, I want to preface with that I've done some research on the use of little people, as you can see written on the top of this video, to refer to people with dwarfism, and it's an accepted term within the community. Obviously, they're not a homogenous group, and not everybody with dwarfism will feel comfortable being referred to as a little person, but generally within the community, it is accepted.
You don't find that suspicious? You don't find that suspicious? Okay, so basically one of three things happened to people who were disabled and enslaved. And trigger warnings for slavery, murder.
Has it frozen for anyone else?
Ableism, just keep an eye out. So the first thing that would happen is that disabled slaves would be killed immediately, especially if there was no prospect for them producing labor. The second thing that would happen is they would likely be sold to the circus or a freak show. In an article for SF Gate, Leroy Moore Jr. talks about how disabled Black people were often linked with entertainment for white audiences, considered freaks and put on display for mockery. The last thing that would happen is disabled slaves oftentimes are also required to work, regardless of their disability. However, their food rations are based on their productivity, so a lot of people just starve to death. Remnants of this practice are still prevalent, as it is legal in 38 states to pay disabled people the minimum wage. Some shocking people take part in this practice, including the Oscars.
Okay, so how does this apply to higher education? Over time, we've only ever reformed our institutions, and this is to quite an extent. So this includes like the workplace, this includes higher education. But nonetheless, the workplace is not designed for disabled people, and higher education is not designed for disabled people. It never was. And the reason why it's not designed for disabled people now is because we've only ever made reforms to the systems and the processes and the institutions that already existed. So now disabled people are encouraged to experience having their labor exploited, but now we have workplace adjustments, and now we have accessibility training. We also give students reasonable adjustments and support resources so that we find it a little bit easier to navigate education. That wasn't designed for this. But this is reform of colonial tools. This is not decolonization. Even though I'm dyslexic and I have Grammarly, it means that people don't necessarily need to proofread my work, but it still means that it's going to take me twice as long to write an email. It still means that I have to engage with written word, which isn't a property across all cultures. So decolonization is so much more than making adjustments and doing training. So I keep talking about reform versus decolonization, and I just want to stop and give a really explicit analogy that will pull the two apart. So for those of you who may not be able to see the images on the screen, we've got the word reform on the left-hand side with an image of a wilted plant above it. And then on the right-hand side, we have the word decolonization with an image of some seeds being planted. So reform. Let's say that this plant represents reform. The plant is very susceptible to rotten roots. It might have chronic plant disease, but we continue to nurture it and seamlessly make the most out of a bad seed, okay? Maybe we do some pruning, we might repot it, we'll give it some water, and then we'll hope for the best. So this is equality, diversity, and inclusion. This is reforming our workplace, but maintaining the workplace. This is reconciliation efforts, okay? Whereas decolonization would mean pulling out the chronically diseased plant and getting a whole new seed. So getting rid of the infrastructure that we've pioneered for 400 years and simply adopting a better idea. This is the distinction between decolonization and reform. So, what would a higher education need in order to actually be decolonized? As capitalism is a colonial, a British colonial cultural property, would have to be decentering the pursuit of capital. So this is social, economic, and political. Avoiding ethnocentrism and cultural imperialism. So avoiding either consciously or unconsciously feeling as though your opinion, your viewpoint, your perspective in life is dominant and it should be enforced on other people, because obviously that's not the case. And when we consciously think about it, we should be able to understand that that shouldn't be the case. Abolishing Western ideas of gender and race. Again, these were just enforced on people during colonialism. And that's a whole nother presentation, but if you want reading on that, then I can definitely give it to you. Eradicating norms of professionalism. There was absolutely no problem me sitting here in a do-rag and my favorite trackies giving you this presentation. I'm pretty sure every single person here has learned something within the last 30 minutes, and what I was wearing had absolutely no impact on your ability to learn. So norms of professionalism are ridiculous and just emulate colonial values and colonial cultural properties. Cutting neo-colonial ties, so cutting ties to the monarchy, for example, or other colonial institutions. Not having a reading list, classroom or workplace hierarchies. Having hierarchies presuppose that there's a hierarchy in epistemology and learning styles, and we know full well that when we assess epistemology, learning styles, or anything, we're going to be doing it from an ethnocentric lens, and then we're going to, as a result, embed cultural imperialism. Not being a member of the Golden Triangle. So the institutions typically considered members of the Golden Triangle have among the highest research incomes of all British universities, and they collaborate closely with initiatives such as the G5. The G5 is a group of 5 English public research universities that was established in early 2004. The members are Imperial College London, LSE, University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, and UCL. So the members of the G5 were initially formed in order to coordinate bidding for an increased share of extra money made available by the government in their summer spending review. That's just the pursuit and centering of capital. So, kings specifically. Would it be appropriate to champion BME women in senior positions as a decolonial effort, or is that just inclusivity and diversification? Is aligning with the University of London, whose Chancellor is Princess Anne, a decolonial position. The royal family, the monarchy, literally spearheaded colonialism. Having Lord Guy as the Chairman Council of Kings, is this influenced by decolonial motives? He was previously the private secretary to Queen Elizabeth II for 10 years. Is belonging to the G5 with its primary motivation being access to capital a decolonial activity? No. The REF, the TEF, Athena Swan, REC, all of these things are motivated by capital. Also, they also have byproducts such as diversification and inclusion practices, but they're not decolonisation, and they do embark on the pursuit of capital. So the main point that I want to make and that I want people to take away is that appropriating the language of marginalized groups, misrepresenting it, and erasing the primary principles of this terminology, whilst at the same time holding a hugely influential position within society globally, is extremely violent. And it's likely there is an argument to be made that the act in itself is colonial and another form of colonialism. People might be thinking that like we can't do all of this overnight and it's going to take time, so like we do need to take small steps, and these small steps might look like reform. Half of that is correct. These small steps do not necessarily need to look like reform. These steps need to reflect decolonial principles in order to be decolonial. So giving Western approval, which is motivated by ethnocentrism, to Black academics to be included on the curriculum or to be in senior positions, in my opinion, is not a step towards decolonisation. It's a step towards neo-colonial reform. So we're maintaining the colonial tools and practices, we're just diversifying what we perceive from our Western perspective to be reputable leading or elite knowledge, or reputable leading or elite individuals. And by no means am I saying that we shouldn't be putting Black people or disabled people or queer people on our reading lists or in more senior positions. What I'm saying is that we have a responsibility to be transparent about the fact that none of these things are decolonisation, and this diversification with the end of maintaining a resource which is regulated using colonial values and principles, which is then embedded into society by a colonial institution, is damaging and violent and is the exact opposite of decolonisation. So I want people to go away, specifically people that work at King's, and think about this question. What would King's actually be without ethnocentrism? What would King's be without cultural imperialism? What would King's be without institutional colonial ties and without neo-colonialism? People can answer that in the chat, but it's kind of more of a rhetorical question. And my last slide is a quote by Audre Lorde, actually the book that Sarah referred to at the beginning. It's really important that people understand that using the exact same tools that oppressors use to oppress people are not going to be the same tools that help us to dismantle these systems and institutions of oppression. Thank you. So I'm going to hand back over to Sarah now for the Q&A.
Thank you, Lauren. There's lots of applause there, and I'm sure if we were in real life, we'd be seeing that. Take a breath. That was amazing, unbelievably, informative and challenging, especially, I suppose, for someone like me who leads EDI and is probably doing all those things and has seen all those things that you've just described as a way of helping fix the future, which is exactly what we've sort of talked about in the past. And what is the compromise, and is the compromise more damaging than doing nothing? So what I'm going to ask you, there are no questions in the chat at the moment that I can see, so people do feel free to put your questions in the chat or put your hand up and I will come to you. We've got about 15 minutes, and my question, I suppose rests a bit in the idea that you and I both work in an EDI team, and so to some extent we're doing a lot of those things you've just described as sort of perpetrating the same over and again. What have you got some examples of good practice in terms of decolonising activity?
So not necessarily explicit examples of good practice, but I can kind of give a general guideline to when you can recognise that something might be decolonial or actually travelling towards the end of decolonisation. So when you're actively negating a colonial tool or a colonial property or a colonial principle, then I think that's when you're working towards decolonisation. So the end of the actions that we are taking have to be for colonial tools and principles to be no longer existent. So the end goal shouldn't be inclusion of other people or that bringing people, I guess, into our doors or making adjustments. It should be that we should be essentially getting rid of those doors and getting rid of the need for adjustments altogether. And I think that's what decolonisation is. I can't really say how we would go about that, because I think that there's an argument for, if we reform and kind of get people into the institution and the workplace, then they can work towards decolonising. But then are they going to work towards decolonising when we've literally brought them into the same institution that is supposed to colonise? And then there's the idea that if we just abolish everything, then what? Like, it's not sustainable. So honestly, I don't know if I answered the question, but
no, and I suppose it's the question I ask myself quite regularly, and we talk about it a bit at work, is it better to be someone who's working on the inside of the tent trying to make things better? Is it better to be on the outside where you can be pure and honest, and what is the right, what are the different lines or points on that spectrum to be able to make a difference? So we have someone called John who has got their hand up, so let me call on them to ask their question or make their point.
Hi, yeah, it's hopefully going to be a question similar to the one that you just asked, actually. First of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was really engaging. And my question is,
Did we lose you there?
is there any word that you use? Oh, look, can you hear me?
I couldn't hear you very well.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try again. So I guess my question is, do you see that being anything that's worth maintaining rather than decolonizing in sort of the, I guess, broadly speaking, Western epistemologies? Because one thing that you mentioned that was ableist was, say, the written word. Do you think that there's anything worth maintaining here that should be preserved?
That's a good question. So I think that there are a lot of things that should be maintained, because a lot of things within British culture have essentially been stolen from colonies. So I don't think it would be good to like eradicate them, but maybe trace them back to before they were misappropriated and keep their original form. In regards to reading lists, like the example you gave and what I was talking about the written word, I don't think we necessarily have to like abolish the written word, but writing essays and reading emails should not be the only means of communicating to people if we're actually going to have an environment that is not just encompassing of colonial norms.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank
the question, John. We've got a question from India. Would the Free Black Uni project be part of decolonial efforts, as an example?
That's a very good question. That's something that I've actually been trying to consider all week based upon like this presentation. I think that in part, yes, but as a whole, no. So decolonisation isn't just about individual institutions. As I said earlier in the presentation, they're all interlinked and they interact with one another. So we have to follow the law. We have to do what our regulatory bodies tell us to do. Otherwise, we won't be an institution in the same way anymore, or one that's regarded in the same way. So I think that because we have to interact with these other institutions in order to literally exist, just like the Free Black University will have to, they can only in part be decolonised. But I think it is definitely a step towards, I guess, the right direction. But I don't think any institution or organisation can exist within the current world context and be decolonised. It's about changing literally everything about our world.
It's a really good point. Thank you, Lauren. You smashed it.
Thank you. There aren't any other hands up and there aren't any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask one. And it's not an easy question, Lauren. I'll come back to you, France, in just a second, if that's okay. So, I mean, we all live in this world. You know, there is what I will describe in inverted commas, because I don't subscribe to it being a debate, but I think some people see it as a debate around gender identity. And I sort of wanted to get your thoughts, I suppose, on how that exposes the impact of colonisation and its legacy on us.
So that's a very good question. I can't answer it in its entirety, but I can kind of give some context and some further reading for people to do. So during colonisation, specifically of Africa, I'm going to talk about Africa, British gender norms, gender roles, so cis-normativity, heteronormativity, were distilled and embedded into those people. So gender isn't something that is innate to Black people. So for example, you would have seen at the beginning, I introduced myself with she, they, he pronouns. I'm having like a very difficult time at the minute to understand myself in terms of gender, because I'm not supposed to have a gender. Like, it's something that was enforced on my ancestors, and now it's something that I have to deal with and live with. And also gender binaries and gender norms are extremely racialized and they rely on white supremacy. So when gender comes into something, race is intrinsically tied, and vice versa. If anybody wants to learn a bit about it, this book was recommended to me. Oh, you can't see it. It's called Black on Both Sides.
The Racial History of Trans Identity.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Super. Thank you, Lauren. I'm sure that we could talk a lot more about that. There are a couple of questions or thoughts in the chat here. So we've got from France Bath. What do you think about how the media uses the words cultural appropriation?
Thank you. So basically, the first half of my thesis is talking about how the term cultural appropriation has been misappropriated in and of itself. So a lot of people completely remove it from the fact that it's upheld by colonialism and imperialism. Also, it's completely taken out of consideration concerning power imbalances. So just like the term racism, people use the term racism to think that everybody who experiences racial prejudice can experience racism, and it's not the case. But the same thing is done with cultural appropriation. So people like myself, as I said at the beginning, are expected to assimilate to the dominant culture. This isn't cultural appropriation, that's assimilation. And I think it's very important, to make sure that, especially within the media, we're doing our own critical thinking and critical analysis of the things that we're being told, especially because I assume that the majority of us here do have access to Google Scholar and research skills, or if not, other people within our departments who can support us doing our own research. But I think that's really important.
Thank you. I think the first name is Harshna. Harshna has asked, do you have any further reading that you would suggest? And they say, amazing presentation, by the way, absolutely loved it. So perhaps what we could do is we could send round afterwards to the oh, you've got a further reading slide, and I wasn't sure. Are you happy to share? Or is the plan to share the slides afterwards, Lauren?
Yes, I'll share the slides afterwards, so everyone will get the further reading and the bibliography.
Super. And we've got a question from Kamleesh. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing people's names or if I'm saying first names or second names in the wrong order. It's always quite difficult to tell on Teams. They ask a similar question about your views about the way the media use the term woke, or I suppose the way the word woke is being used in general.
I actually can't speak on this one. I do know that the term woke was specifically founded within like radical community, but I can't speak on what its actual kind of roots are or actual definition is. But I do definitely hear it thrown around a lot within the media and the mainstream.
It's interesting the way it's become a sort of shorthand, but both different sides use it in different ways. We've got another question from John.
Hi again. I'm sort of hesitant to ask this question because I know that it's going to be too much to answer here, but perhaps you can refer me to some other sort of literature on the matter. And it's kind of a philosophical question about the idea of cultural appropriation. I really struggle to understand sort of what level of group we can say owns something, whether it's tangible or intangible, like a practice, say for instance, do-rags. I happen to be Black, middle class, and I wonder to what extent I can say that's part of my culture by virtue of my race. But then I suppose in terms of at the level of culture, perhaps someone who's white or Asian who grew up in an inner city, perhaps it's more so their culture because of their actual lived experience. And I wonder at what level do we say this group owns something, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, and it's a very good question. So within my thesis, I talk about how people don't own cultural properties, we steward them. So it should be our responsibility to look after them, to maintain them, and to make sure that the history and the detail about them don't get erased. And also, because of the historical context of colonialism and capitalism, etc., it's often the case that Black people will be demonized or seen as unprofessional by wearing do-rags and things like that. But when people who aren't Black do it, it's more of a fashion trend or something that people get social clout for or even capital from. So I think it's the issue that when people who is an intrinsic part of their culture practice it, it's seen as and interpreted as bad. And then when other people do it, it's seen and interpreted as fun or interesting. But whilst at the same time it's seen as fun or interesting, we are still living within the current context of colonialism and imperialism. So unless we have worked to eradicate that and eradicate this inequality of like how people are perceived, I don't think it's fair for other people to essentially take cultural properties that should be stewarded and protected by other people, especially in a way where they haven't done their own research on it. They're likely going to misrepresent and erase it, and then they're going to commodify it by gaining social or economic capital. And it just feels very immoral. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank
Jazz
you.
put a last question in the chat, but I don't think we've got time for you to do it justice, Lauren. So we'll have to think of a different way of answering that. Sarah said we'll be sending around the recordings and the slides. You've got lots of good feedback. I'm going to try and sum up and close the event on time. So, I mean, thank you, Lauren. I mean, you and I work together and it gives me enormous pride that we work together because I think, you've been amazing today, and we need more and more people like you who are willing to use their knowledge and expertise to help challenge the rest of our thinking. I think the things I'm taking away is there's something about examining the motivation of any action or anything that anybody is doing, because that is, I think, the heart of some of what you were saying around decolonisation. What is it that you are doing this for and why? And so that then comes into what's the source of your information, what's the source of your thinking, why do I think what I think? You know, so constantly asking ourselves that question, and who does what I'm thinking or what I'm doing benefit, seem to me to be some of the keys to decolonisation. I don't know that in the sort of dystopian world we live in that the purity of the decolonisation you've outlined is possible, but I think that's what you also know. But if we're not radical in our thinking, we don't make any progress. So I'd really like to thank you. I'd really like to thank everyone who's come. I'd like to thank the Entrepreneurship Institute and Sarah Amanda for coming up with the idea of the topic. And Lauren's been fantastic. There is a whole range of other events that are coming up. I haven't got the links to hand, but we will post them. And I would really encourage you all to do what Lauren said, reflect on today, come back and watch the recording. We are at KCL Diversity on Twitter. Do share your thoughts with us there. This isn't a once and done conversation. The very nature of what Lauren talked about is essentially how do we generate all of the thinking and action that we need for the future. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone and close the meeting.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for coming.